So, Anthony Peake is a British writer whose work focuses on near-death experience, déjà vu, and the nature of reality. His books are Is There Life After Death? And The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self. Anthony Peake and I stumbled into each other through Facebook, and I'm glad to talk to him today for the Diet Soap podcast. So, Anthony, thank you for coming on my little show.
Absolutely delighted to be involved on your show. It was fantastic to contact with you via Facebook as well, and just looking into your interests in terms of a philosophical interest. I think we overlap in so many different areas as well. So I think this is going to be a fascinating discussion, and probably one of the most intellectually interesting ones I think I'll have done in recent months, if not years. I think.
Now I have a lot to live up to. Okay, let's see if I can do that. So, yeah, I noticed that you were a fan of Philip K. Dick, and I'm also, of course, a big fan of his work. But rather than start there, I wanted to start with your ideas about déjà vu and how your understanding of that phenomenon connects to your ideas about ontology or reality and being. So can we start with that phenomena?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, déjà vu was probably the reason why I started writing in the first place, because around about 10 years ago now, I had this overwhelming urge to write a book, but I didn't know what I was going to write about. And I was in the fortunate position that I'd done a reasonable business contract, and I was in the position that I had a little bit of money available to me to spend a little bit of time out writing. But I really didn't know what I was going to be writing about. And the very first day I started writing, as us writers know, you have the blank screen in front of you thinking, well, where am I going to start? And the strange thing was I started to have telltale signs of a migraine aura, because I suffer from classic migraine. And as you probably know, classic migraine is subtly different from ordinary migraine in the sense that you have an aura sensation, and sometimes you don't even get the headache. And I sensed that a migraine was going to start because I had the tingling in my lips and the tingling in my fingers. And one of the other aspects of my migraine aura is quite strong déjà vu sensations, in the sense of sort of a recognition of a scene, as if, at some time in an indeterminate part of my past, I've experienced this scene before. And I was looking outside of the window of my house, and I suddenly had this huge recollection that I'd sat in front of that blank screen, looking at that view over Horsham in West Sussex, down here in England. And I'd realised that this was what I needed to write about, was déjà vu, because I suddenly started reading about it, and I was quite surprised to discover that although it is one of the most common, 70% of the population of the world is claimed experience at some time or another a déjà sensation, but effectively it's very little understood. And I was fortunate to find a paper written by a person who has now become a close friend of mine, Dr. Arthur Funkhauser, who is an American who's based in Bern in Switzerland, who's written 2 or 3 papers on déjà vu. And one of his papers was called The Dream Theory of Déjà Vu. And his hypothesis is that a déjà vu sensation is effectively because you are remembering a dream. You've had a recent dream, and you've effectively forgotten it, as we do with most of our dreams. And the dream starts to become real. You start to experience it, and the memory is evoked from the experience of the dream. And this fascinated me so much that I really started to dive into the whole phenomenon of the déjà sensation. I use the term déjà sensation rather than déjà vu because, of course, déjà vu is already seen, whereas what we're talking about here is a subtly different phenomenon called déjà vécu, which is already lived. And indeed, this is very much art's position on it. The déjà vécu is subtly different from déjà vu. And I was quite surprised when I started researching this, because I thought, well, I'll write a book on the déjà sensation. And I very quickly found myself moving into some very, very interesting areas of neurology.
Could I just jump in here and ask you to clarify that distinction between déjà vu and déjà recu? Is that what you said?
Yeah, déjà vécu. Yeah, déjà vu is already seen. So effectively, it's a sensation that you've seen something before, whereas déjà vécu is not just the seeing the scene around you, but this curious sensation that this what I'm experiencing, I have lived it before. In other words, I've lived this in a three-dimensional way. It's a surround sensation that this has been lived before, not just seen before.
It strikes me that with déjà vu, just that if you have the sensation that you've seen something before, that you might, if you take that literally, you'll have that experience all the time. I live in the same house every day. I see the same things all the time. It's when you feel like you've lived that whole moment.
Yes, yes,
that's what I think of as being déjà vu. But why this distinction in the terminology?
In terms of, I suppose, for argument's sake, there tends to be what I term in my writing a type 2 déjà sensation or déjà vécu sensation, because you can also have déjà senti, which is already heard, déjà rêve, which is already dreamed, which is technically which Art Funkhauser discusses. Most of these terminologies, by the way, were actually suggested by a guy local to you, a guy called Professor Vernon Neppe, who works in Seattle and has a psychiatric business. I think it's called the Pacific Psychiatric Institute, I think, in Seattle. You're in Oregon, aren't you, I think?
I find that's very interesting, just to stick to these different kinds of déjà experiences, because it is true, I mean, just from my own experience, that I've had dreams where I thought while I was dreaming somehow that I'd had this dream before. That's like a near lucid dream. I wouldn't say that this is one that was lucid, but near lucid, where I thought, oh yes, I'm having this dream again. And then upon waking, I would think, oh, I've never really had that dream before. Why did I think that was a repeated dream? And also, why didn't I recognize, if I could recognize it was a dream, why didn't I recognize I was sleeping? Which is sometimes so I've definitely had that experience. And then the idea that but with déjà vu, or déjà vécu, it seems to me that I almost always, when I have what I would call a déjà vu experience, I'm experiencing a moment completely, not just a sound, not just a sight, but the full moment. And I almost wonder, I can't quite imagine what it would be like to think that you heard something exactly that way, in that lived way, before, and having that be anything strange, unless it was a sense of being connected to a lived moment,
Yes. Yeah. It's a very fine line between déjà vu and déjà vécu. But in terms of the way Art and I describe it, it's very much, as I say, it's a much more all-encompassing sensation, and the sense of precognition, or the sense that you know what's going to happen next, is stronger felt in a déjà vécu feeling, because if you have already lived it, effectively it means that at some time in your past you have lived this moment before. And of course, that's when I started to really look into the linkage between the déjà sensations and an allied phenomenon called near-death experience. Because there is a particular neurotransmitter that it's linked very strongly with migraine, and interestingly enough, with an even stronger neurological sensation, which is called temporal lobe epilepsy, which has an even stronger aura sensation and even stronger déjà sensations before somebody has a temporal lobe seizure, or a petit malabsence, as they're technically called. And this again is linked with a particular neurotransmitter that's focused on the particularly active in the temporal lobes of the brain, which is called glutamate. Because glutamate is considered to be responsible for migraine, temporal lobe epilepsy, and near-death experience. So clearly, what we are discussing here are probably allied neurological phenomenon. And again, if you talk to people who've had near-death experiences, I was intrigued to discover that a lot of people would report this phenomenon that they call the panoramic life review. Where people turn around and say, my life flashed before my eyes. And I thought to myself, well, if your life flashes before your eyes, the implication is that it's been recorded in some way. And effectively, if you go back to the work of people like Carl Pribram and David Bohm about the holographic nature of memory, and the writings of Michael Talbot, it clearly suggests that the human brain, sort of effectively records its experiences for some bizarre, unknown reason. And it could be that this is because in the final moments of life, instead of as you're actually in a real death experience rather than a near-death experience, your life doesn't actually flash at all, but it recreates in a matrix-like recreation of your life in a literal minute-by-minute subjective, minute-by-minute time recreation of your life. In which case, as I know that you're quite fascinated by this idea of what the nature of reality is. And effectively, if you were living in a holographic regeneration of a past life experience, how would you know that you were not experiencing it for the first time? Indeed, how could you tell that it was or was not an illusion?
Right. I mean, this is the thing about Deja, the Deja experience, just from my understanding of it, and it's not something that I've studied the way you have, but just thinking back on my own personal experiences, there's a sense to you feel like you're repeating the same scene again that you've experienced before, and also you may think you know what's going to happen next, or you may even be able to say what's going to happen next, but the biggest impact of that is a sense of unreality that comes out of that. You're actually less connected to the scene than you would have been if you hadn't had that experience. There's some part of you that seems to kind of shift away from the lived moment. It does take on that quality of being Memorex. And I would say that more important than actual precognition is that feeling of alienation from the scene that you're in.
There is an argument to say, and certain psychologists and neurologists would say that it's. I think it was Wigan was one of the original neurologists or psychologists that really studied this, and I think they likened it to disassociation. That effectively it's almost a disassociation from reality, a receding away, because of course there's the mirror image phenomenon of déjà entendu, which is the complete opposite, whereby everything looks strange. Sometimes you look at yourself in the mirror and you suddenly have this complete opposite of recognition where you think, good Lord. Again, it's what Jean-Paul Sartre would call nausea, isn't it? The sensation that suddenly everything looks strange, or you see reality as it really is for a quick second, where you see that reality behind the reality. So I do very much take that idea as well. But ironically enough, I regularly do radio programs over here in the UK on the BBC, and a few months ago I did a radio program on the deja vu sensation, and I had a caller call in who said that he had a really profound deja sensation while watching television with his wife, where he knew what the characters on the television were going to say next, and he became so disturbed that he walked out of his living room, and as he did so, he knew that two men would walk past the window, and they did. And then he went upstairs, and he was so sure he knew what would happen when he went back downstairs and what his wife would say, that he wrote it on a piece of paper, what she was going to say to him when he went back downstairs into the living room, walked into the living room. She said the very words, and then he handed her the piece of paper with the words she would say written on it. Because, of course, the major problem is, and people who experience temporal lobe epilepsy, and I know quite a few people who have this experience in the aura state, that they know what's going to happen next. And I've said to them, well, why don't you say so? Why don't you turn around and say to somebody, I know what you're going to say? And there's been some very interesting reactions. One guy said, well, I can't, because if I did so, I would change the future, and I can't do that. In other words, the idea that the future is out there to be experienced. But somebody else said an even more prosaic answer, and they said, well, that's ridiculous, because if you were about to say something to me and I preempted this by telling you what you'd say, you wouldn't say it, would you? And therefore my prediction would cease to be a prediction, and the future wouldn't have been as I'd seen it to be. And of course, in my writing, I'm quite preoccupied with Everett's many worlds interpretation of particle physics, and the idea, are there alternate futures out there, and what is the nature of time, and how do we move through it? So there's some very intriguing philosophical ideas attached to this.
That story about someone handing the piece of paper over to his wife, and it has the words that she's going to say, written on it. Is one that not only is a powerful image, and I believe it happened, but also, I've written that scene, I've seen that scene. That's in Groundhog Day. I mean, that scene is very powerful, has a lot of resonance. I don't believe I've ever lived it literally, but I know that scene. But I still wonder about this concept of disassociation from reality that's taking place alongside of. It seems like, yes, you do have, let's just grant you that you have people who can literally predict what's going to happen next. And that does open up all these paradoxes about, that basically it's the grandmother paradox from time travel stories, right? Only it applies to the future as well as the past. But so that's very problematic, and your head starts to hurt if you think about that. But the other thing is that the feeling of alienation and recognition supposes that there is something unreal about this timeline that you can see, right? You're disassociating from reality, but then that presupposes that we know what reality is, that these social scenes that we're in, that the television scene that we're watching, that these are real. And so we're kind of begging the question of what reality is. And when we say somebody's disassociating from it, what they're disassociating from is, I don't know.
Effectively, one of the things that my writing has developed over the years, to the extent now that I'm quite fascinated by, what is reality? How do we define reality? How do we know what is consistent? I've interviewed over recent months some quite famous individuals such as Tom Campbell and Robert Waggoner and lucid dreamers and people who supposedly have out-of-the-body experiences. And again, all these things bring it back to the idea, what is reality? Is reality consensual? What exactly is consensual reality? If somebody claims to experience an out-of-the-body experience, are they sharing a consensual experience of reality out there? Or is it more a personal experience of what reality is? And ironically enough, I've recently been offered and accepted a research fellowship at the Centre for Advanced Studies, which is run by Professor Irvin Laszlo. And I don't know if you know about Laszlo and his theories regarding the zero point field and 0 point energy.
No, tell me about that.
Okay. The Laszlo suggests that there is a form of energy, which again it is hypothetically possible, and indeed is believed to exist. For instance, I noticed that you're originally from Colorado. Mm-hmm. And funnily enough, I was over in Denver last year, and there is a company in Boulder who have got a USA patent for actually finding ways of drawing up what's called 0 point energy from the 0 point field. And put simply, what the 0 point field is that they have found that there is a form of energy that seems to be drawn up where there should be no energy. In fact, in what's called the quantum vacuum. And the quantum vacuum exists at around about 4 degrees above absolute zero, where there should be no real energy moving around, and yet energy happens. There's something called the Casimir effect. And this energy is supposed to be the energy that's given off between subatomic particles, and it's virtually limitless. Now, there are other arguments that have suggested, and Laszlo has suggested, that this energy field is digital, contains information. And it is similar to the old belief of the Hindus and the Buddhists that there's something called the Akasha, the Akashic record, the record of something that contains information about everything. And I've taken this hypothesis and applied some of the work done by Roger Penrose and an American anesthesiologist by the name of Stuart Hammerhoff, who's professor of anesthesiology at Arizona Medical School in Tucson. Yeah, I think it is Tucson. And they've been working on something called the ORC-R theory, which is that microtubules, which are very, very small protein structures within the neurons of the brain, can be affected by subatomic quantum effects, and that consciousness itself is an element of subatomic effects. Now, if this is the case, this really brings into question the nature of reality, because as you're probably aware, the Copenhagen interpretation, as suggested by Niels Bohr and Max Born and co., very much suggests that reality is brought into existence by the act of observation or the act of measurement by a sentient being. So in which case this really begs the question of whether we draw forth reality from the quantum field and we model it holographically and then project it out to perceive reality in the way we do.
The thing there is that still begs the question of who we are,
Oh, totally. Who is the observer? Who is the observer? Is the observer a manifestation of individual consciousness? Are we some form of collective consciousness? Are we a kind of a part of a greater whole, and we individuate in effect? Again, what Philip K. Dick would argue about, Valis and such like, and the idea that there is some kind of huge field of intelligence out there and we're just part of it. Because it's strange, isn't it, when we think about the concept of the observer, who am I? When you think back and you think, well, I'm an observing sentient being. But when you do what the Buddhists do and reflect upon the observer itself, it disappears. That suddenly you reflect inwardly and you suddenly think, what exactly am I? Where am I? Where am I located? Am I located in spatial? Am I in space? This kind of thing. And it's fascinating. And this is why one of my favorite movies is Waking Life, because in Waking Life, Linklater pulls up some very, very profound questions about the nature of reality. And indeed, do you know the famous discussion by Juliet Delpy and Ethan Hawke in that movie when they're discussing the idea, they're lying in bed and they're discussing, maybe I'm a little old lady dying in the final seconds of my life, living my life again in an illusion. And of course, this is my cheating the ferryman hypothesis that I put forward in my first book.
But okay, let me just see if I can address some of everything that you've said by referring to a very obscure piece of art. There's this conceptual artist named Joseph Koseth, I think is how you would say his name, and he does his work just with written words for the most part. Probably his most famous work is one where there's a picture of a chair and then an actual chair beside it, and then this is like on a museum wall, and then the chair is set in front of the large photograph, and then there's a definition of the chair. And so it's all about representation, right? But for me, the easiest work that he's done for me to grasp is something called 5 Words in Orange Neon. Now, what it is an orange neon sign that says 5 words in orange neon. Okay, so, yeah, and the question is, why does that have an effect? Why is that anything? And it's more, the reason why it is something is because it's more than it needs to be. The words themselves, 5 words in orange neon, communicate the image. The fact that it literally is 5 words in orange neon means that it's more than it needs to be. It's excessive. The actual orange neon is almost getting in the way of the message of the sign. Because it creates this odd effect. You laugh at it. What, it's a funny joke. But if let's say we're living in a holographic universe, that you can't forget the orange and neon. That there's and it's not just something as simple as the material world, but it's that effect between the material world and the words, 5 words in orange neon. That strange discontinuity, that strange excessive force, the contradiction between 5 words in orange neon and the actual literal orange neon, that's, I think, what is real. But it's a concept that's not just coming from this guy Joseph Koseth. It's coming from my vague understanding of Hegel and reading Slavoj Žižek, who I talk about way too much. And so it's something I'm still wrestling with. But it is something that as I approach like this idea of a life as a representation, that I'm trying to hold on to, because I think it's all too easy to slip into a solipsistic bubble where you think, oh, well, I am simply creating my own reality. And I don't believe that's what's happening. But there are these moments where you have a choice to act. It's not that you can bring forward a whole new matrix, but you can maybe recoordinate the matrix. You can act in a way that isn't already pre-programmed by the matrix. But it's not that you just think it.
Yes. I think one of the major problems is, isn't it, with, and I know that's one of the accusations in raised commas that's been made of my work is the implied solipsism. It's almost neo-Berkeleyan in its approach to the nature of consciousness, and it's the problem, the famed problem of other minds. And do other minds exist? And indeed, could I ever tell whether other minds actually do exist? And of course, if you take it to its logical extreme, no, I can't, because I can't interface, I can't elicit the information internally to know that other minds do exist. However, what I do is that my model suggests that the nature of consciousness is a far more all-encompassing thing, that it's out there almost like a field, and that we attune into the consciousness field, as it were, and the idea, there's writings of people like Lynn McTaggart and people like that are suggesting this in different ways, because it's the mystery of exactly what it is to be sentient, what is it to be a self-referential being in an inanimate universe, and I find that the more I read about philosophy, the more it intrigues me. But I also find that the more I read, the less I know, because it just opens up so many channels of thought, and I sort of wrestle with Hegel, and I wrestle with Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein and people like that. And at least I'm starting to now vaguely understand what they're talking about. For years, I read Wittgenstein, I go, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. But recently it started to click a little bit more, I think. And I don't know whether it's because I'm far more understanding of just how precise the words you use are to define the things you mean, and indeed what you mean by things. It's what is a thing?
Well, Wittgenstein is one that I studied in college as an undergraduate, and I probably was in your camp there, is going, well, I think I get it, But what I've found, as I've explored philosophy again now that I've been coming back to it and talking to college professors and such, is that the same problem keeps coming up in all these various guises. Like, I'll pick up a book by a Marxist philosopher. I had this book by Henri Lefebvre.
Oh, yes. I
made a little video about him, and it's called The Production of Space, and I'm very interested in that.
The right to the city stuff, isn't it?
Right. And but what's interesting there is that the divide between theory and praxis that Marx talks about is actually, it seems to me, a recapitulation of the divide between the mind and the body, or between the material world and our perceptions. Or if you want to go to Spinoza, it would be between what's necessary and what's contingent. And so we run up against this contradiction in all of these different works. And what I'm about these days, what I'm trying to do is not solve the contradiction, but embrace it or make that the basis of my philosophy. And again, I'm being led by greater minds than my own, but it's still difficult, and I still kind of fall either far to the materialist side or far to the idealist side too often, and walking in between is tricky business.
I agree because I find the same thing. I swing from one extreme to the other, and through I find it quite strange that some people will accuse me of being a reductionist materialist because they don't necessarily understand the viewpoint I'm taking, and other people will argue that I'm an arch idealist, and the argument is that I'm both and neither, because I think the definitions themselves are probably, to use the idea, of the old idea of postmodernism. The idea is really that, it's a meta narrative, whereas it's really a micro narrative, and I find. I sometimes think that sometimes I can grasp things intuitively, but I can't actually put them into linguistic structures because words are inadequate to explain the things you try to put forward, because we're just trapped by the language that we have to use to define the experiences we have and the world we try to describe. As I've got older, this is one of the things I've struggled with, is just trying to put into words. For instance, at the moment, I'm writing my fourth book on time, and I find as soon as you start writing about time, you get in such terrible problems grammatically, even because to use time as a definition, and suddenly you're suddenly finding the verb structures you're using are incorrect because to use the term being, it's just in terms of time, is that something that goes through time, or is being a point in time? Yeah. And at what point is being, but it's already gone. By the time you focus on the fact you're being, it's already gone, and it's back in the past. It's I'm very much reading a lot of McTaggart at the moment, and his idea about the unreality of time, and it's fascinating stuff. Really, really deeply intriguing writing. But you start talking to members of the public, and you say, "Well, is time a reality?" And they say, of course it is, but I always revert back to to what St. Augustine said. That I know exactly what time is until somebody asks me to define it, and I haven't got a clue, because we all do that. It's
So let me ask you, when you were sitting there in front of your computer and you had that aura, migraine aura, did you actually get the headache after?
Well, funnily enough, ironically enough, I've ceased to get the headaches. I haven't had the headaches now for, well, that's not true actually. Recently, I did have a migraine that did develop into a headache for a time, but these days I just get the aura, and indeed I find it fascinating because I get the scotoma, I get the blind spot and everything else, and I also get that. You clearly understand it because you're a migrainer
No,
yourself.
I've had bad headaches,
Oh,
but
right.
I've had headaches that were bad enough that made me look up migraines, but they weren't. No, I did not have a migraine. I had a sinus headache. They would wake me up every
Okay.
certain time of night.
Because the book to read on this is Oliver Sacks, who wrote
Yeah.
a book, strange enough, migraine, and it really tells you exactly how it is that you can have almost noetic experiences during a migraine aura, because it is. The severe migraine auras are actually called epileptogenic, in the sense that they're actually moving into temporal lobe epilepsy, and there is an overlap area whereby the etiology is quite similar for both of them. So there is a linkage there, and it does seem that you seem to touch upon, you break through to another kind of perception of reality, which tends to be quite strange, I have to say. So the possibilities are quite staggering at the moment, because the way in which my work is being taken on by people across the world. I mean, it is really quite surprising how academics are taking it on board as well. For instance, there is a consultant neurologist and a consultant psychologist in Austria who have been applying some of my hypotheses, because I don't even call them theories, because they're not. They're a hypothesis. They haven't been tested in any way. And indeed, it's quite difficult to test anything empirically when it's to do with consciousness and perception anyway. So, but they're actually working on a machine that can stimulate out of the body experiences or noetic experiences or altered states of consciousness by using stroboscopic light. And we are concluding, myself and the two guys are concluding, that what is happening is that this particular light machine, because they've tested it, very, very scientifically and very rigorously, and we think what it does is it generates endogenous, that is internally generated dimethyltryptamine in the pineal gland of the brain. So effectively, the human body itself will generate probably the most powerful hallucinogenic drug known internally, and bring about access to altered states of consciousness. And of course, the question is, when somebody goes into an altered state of consciousness, are they still within reality, a greater reality? Because for instance, if you talk to people who lucid dream, they will argue that in lucid dream states, the reality is in fact imbued with a greater reality than the reality that is normal consensual reality. You read people like Stephen LeBerg and Robert Wagner. These guys are clearly traveling in another reality that has consistency and has logic within it as well. And do you go there? Can you go internally there? And in my next book, I'll be discussing what I call the intramatic model, where I'm suggesting that it's not an hallucination. You do go somewhere else. And it's somewhere other when, never were. It's somewhere else completely different that's not within odd 3 dimensions of time and 3 dimensions of space. It's somewhere entirely different.
Well, we should pick up on lucid dreaming and talk about that on your next visit to the Diet Cell podcast.
Reading your interests and who your interests are. I'd like to have a chat, about people like Guy Debord and Lefebvre and people like that, because they're people that have fascinated me for a long time as well. Because I, rather like yourself, I studied, when I was at university, I studied Marx and Hegel and Feuerbach and people like that to a great degree, particularly the German idealist philosophers.
Feuerbach and that gang have something to say to the people who are interested in lucid dreaming.
I think probably the person really is probably more than anybody's Fichte. If you read any of his stuff,
I need to get on to that.
Oh wow, what a neglected genius that guy was. Incredible, just incredible the way his philosophy works and how much it ties into my own. It was quite uncanny
The trouble for me these days is finding the time to do the reading I need to do alongside everything else. But how about this? Why don't we plan on the next time you come on, I'll have read some Fichte and we'll talk about lucid dreaming.